Lecture 2, Ideology, the Origins of the Cold War, Section 1, Marxism. In the last lecture, I introduced the term, the New World Order, as one way to explain the goal of American foreign policy at the end of the Cold War. The goal, as it was articulated by George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States, seemed a return to the same kind of idealism that spurred the creation of international institutions such as the League of Nations and the United Nations. Bush wanted
a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations.
Through collective security and open diplomacy, the international community of states could work together to avoid a return to world war, as well as contain and sanction aggressive states, finally holding them to respect the sovereignty of their neighbors. Created in 1945, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Charter of the United Nations clearly states that we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to regain faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure by the acceptance of principles and the institution of methods that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest. The Gulf War, which was a United Nations sanctioned military intervention led by the United States, finally saw the international community put these principles into practice. They acted effectively to Iraq's invasion, occupation, and annexation of Kuwait. Kuwait was liberated and Saddam Hussein's Iraq was put under heavy economic sanction and partial occupation for the next 12 years, until the start of the Iraq War in 2003, when the Americans, without sanction from the United Nations and in violation of international law, invaded Iraq, toppled Saddam Hussein's regime, and began a protracted military occupation of the country. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, made it clear that the Americans were acting in defiance of the United Nations. In an interview with the BBC, he was asked outright if the Iraq War was illegal. He replied, "Yes, if you wish. I've indicated it was not in conformity with the UN Charter. From our point of view, and from the Charter point of view, it was illegal." Here is Annan expressing his concern in somewhat more diplomatic language.
Perhaps if we had persevered a little longer, Iraq could yet have been disarmed peacefully, or if not, the world could have taken action to solve this problem by a collective decision, endowing it with greater legitimacy and therefore commanding wider support than is the case now. But let us not dwell on the divisions of the past. Let us confront the realities of the present, however harsh, and look for ways to forge stronger unity in the future.
George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, justified the war against Iraq in the terms of national security, not international law. Here he is explaining the American position on March 17, 2003, 3 days before the invasion.
The United States of America has the sovereign authority to use force in assuring its own national security. That duty falls to me as Commander-in-Chief. By the oath I have sworn, by the oath I will keep.
So while the immediate post-Cold War period after the collapse of the Soviet Union seemed to see the rise of idealism as a dominant paradigm for international relations, the immediate post-9/11 period saw a return to realism, with individual states asserting their right to exercise power and perpetrate war in their own self-interest, regardless of ideals that may be in the interests of humanity as a whole. This movement leads us to the first scholarly article I've asked you to read, International Relations, One World, Many Theories by Stephen Walt, a professor of international relations at Harvard. He uses slightly different language, substituting in the word liberalism for what we so far have termed idealism. Walt writes, the study of international affairs is best understood as a protracted competition between the realist, liberal, and radical traditions. Realism emphasizes the enduring propensity for conflict between states, whereas liberalism identifies several ways to mitigate these conflictive tendencies, and the radical tradition, associated with Soviet communism, describes how the entire system of state relations might be transformed. Communism, as will be discussed below, was the ideology of the Soviet Union, the set of ideas that framed the economics, politics, and the culture of the USSR, and which conflicted with the ideology of the United States, often described as capitalism. However, before diving into an explanation of communism, I should point to a difficulty with Walt's presentation in relation to my introduction of the theories of realism and idealism from Lecture 1. A theory is a broad category to describe something, or perhaps better put, it is a lens through which an analysis can occur to explain something. So the theory of realism explains international relations because it accurately describes the behavior of international actors as inherently selfish. Alternatively, the theory of idealism explains international relations because it accurately describes the behavior of international actors as inherently rational and peaceful. An ideology, however, is something different and more specific. The term ideology is first used in the late 18th century in the wake of the French Revolution. The French Enlightenment philosopher Destutt de Tracy coined the term, which he explained meant the science of ideas. Strictly speaking, ideology means that the human mind develops or evolves new ideas throughout history, and after many errors, conflicts, and much tragedy, we reach a point or historic moment where we finally figure the right and proper way to live. With this set of ideas in mind, we then are compelled to go about transforming the world to match this perfect vision of future reality. So rather than merely a description of how things are, as is the goal of a theory, an ideology attempts to describe how things ought to be. From here, you can see why competing ideologies are a bigger deal or are far more consequential than great debates over theories in international relations. Believers in an ideology are motivated to change everyone's mind so that they understand why and how the world should be transformed, whether through civil war and revolution, or the global conflict that was the Cold War. To better understand the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, we need to take a look at the ideologies that back each country. So first, we're going to take a look here at Soviet communism. The German philosopher Karl Marx, the progenitor of communism, writes in his 1848 Communist Manifestos that human beings only will be free with the elimination of the distinction between the rich and poor. This is why Marx writes, famously, "Workers of the world unite," at the end of his manifesto. Because of the deprivations of capitalism, the worker must realize that their bosses are exploiting them. They must then unite to overthrow the capitalist system as a whole. Importantly, Marx calls upon the workers of the entire world, not just the workers of Germany, where he was writing. But, looking at his native Germany, Marx recognized that the citizenry was not free and equal at all, but divided along the lines of class. The rich, who owned all of the property and ran all of the industries, ruled over the poor, who were exploited for their labor, allowing the rich to get richer and richer. While other people argued that things like labor unions and social programs backed by a welfare state could help the poor out of their miserable situation, Marx instead argued that the only way to solve the problem was violent revolution. So instead of merely organizing and protesting, Marx called for a radical revolution that would overthrow the present economic and political system and replace it with a communist society where the people or the state owned everything, all property, equally. The workers then had to unite in this cause. And Marx argued that this revolution was inevitable. In the Communist Manifesto, he writes, "The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produce and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. In other words, the capitalist system will itself bring about the condition for a communist revolution. The working class, or proletariat as Marx called them, must realize their interests are incompatible with and opposed to those of the dominant classes of capitalists, or what Marx calls the bourgeoisie. As he famously says in a different work, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Critically, Marx claimed that the capitalist system is, in the long run, self-destructive. Again, it has created its own gravediggers. Marx's theory of surplus value goes on to explain that workers can only be exploited for so long until they have no more labor to exploit. This is what Marx calls the state of immiseration, which literally means a state of complete misery. At this point, the workers of the world would unite to overthrow the property-owning class and create a workers' paradise where there would be complete satisfaction from material want and complete equality of property. Decades later, a young university student by the name of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov read Marx's theories, and they inspired him to return to his native Russia to help start the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which after a long civil war saw to the creation of the communist Soviet Union. Of course, Ulyanov had changed his name to Lenin and became the first leader of the Soviet Union, or USSR.
Советских организаций. Отныне наступает новая полоса в истории России. И данная третья русская революция должна будет в своем конечном итоге привести к победе социализма.
By the way, the term Bolshevik is derived from the Russian word for majority, and was the name of a faction that ended up taking control of the revolution. In truth, the Bolshevik Party, led by Lenin, only represented a very small minority of Russians. After the revolution, the Bolsheviks became the leaders of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the one and only party allowed to rule with no semblance of democratic legitimacy through elections. But Lenin argued that the Soviet Union could not allow democracy because Russians had yet to fully realize the profound truth of communist ideology, and may still be polluted by counter-revolutionary capitalist thinking. As he wrote in his revolutionary pamphlet, What is to be Done, at this point, we wish to state only that the role of vanguard fighter can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory. Now, in this brief introduction to Soviet communism, I've introduced two important points for our understanding of the origins of the Cold War. First, capitalism is a necessary stage in the inevitable development of communism. Second, communism in the Soviet Union cannot be democratic until counter-revolutionary thinking is eliminated. These 2 points are also highlighted by Mr. X, the mysterious author of our second reading for this lecture, The Sources of Soviet Conduct. Mr. X was actually a high-ranking diplomat named George Kennan, serving in the USSR between 1944 and 1946. After World War II, it quickly dawned on the Americans that the Soviets, who were allies during the war, were not interested in supporting their new vision of a post-World War II Europe or the establishment of new international institutions. To try to understand their new rivals, they asked Kennan to assess the motivations of the Soviets. He replied in what is called the Long Telegram, which was sent in late February of 1946. That telegram became a more detailed report, and that report became the article published under the pseudonym X, to avoid the appearance that it was the official policy of the American government. Kennan begins by writing, "The political personality of Soviet power, as we know it today, is the product of ideology and circumstances. Ideology inherited by the present Soviet leaders from the movement in which they had their political origin, and circumstances of the power which they now have, exercised for nearly 3 decades in Russia." This relates to one of Kennan's main points in Article X. The circumstances of the immediate post-revolution period, the existence in Russia of civil war and foreign intervention, together with the obvious fact that the communists represented only a tiny minority of the Russian people, made the establishment of dictatorial power a necessity. Kennan further explained that the Soviets maintained their dictatorial rule out of a belief of what he described the nature of the mental world of the Soviet leaders. That capitalist counter-revolutionaries, both inside and outside of their country, were constantly plotting to undermine the goals of the revolution. Now, problematically, the Soviets' motivation was not then simply to transform Russian society, but also the rest of the world, including the United States. This understandably becomes a key concern for the Americans and also suggests that the antagonisms that developed during the early Cold War can be found in the Soviet desire to expand their influence globally. Through internal oppression and external aggression, they thought they would eventually prevail, purging capitalism from the face of the earth. But critically, we have seen that the Kremlin is under no ideological compulsion to accomplish its purpose in a hurry. Because the communist ideology describes the inevitable failure of capitalism, Kennan suggests that the Soviets are unlikely to behave in a rushed or panicky manner. This leads to his most influential observation. In these circumstances, it is clear that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Ultimately, he decides the limits of the Russian economy, the failures of the leadership, and the exhaustion of its own people were the seeds of its own decay, and that the sprouting of these seeds is well advanced. On the face of it, we can now see a clear antagonism between communism, as expressed by Marx and Lenin, and capitalism. The ideology of capitalism, as it was understood and developed in the United States, will be one of the subjects of Section 2. But before that, here is your assigned question. Why are the communistic and capitalist ideologies in conflict?